When I came back from my second deployment in Afghanistan, my parents sat me down with coffee and smiles and told me they had exciting news about the old house. I thought they meant renovations. Instead, they'd sold my childhood home, pocketed $340,000, and destroyed every memory I had left of my brother who died in that house. When I found out the truth, I realized I'd been fighting the wrong enemy overseas. The plan was supposed to be simple: finish my 18-month deployment with the 4th Infantry Division, come home to Colorado, take some leave, and figure out what civilian life looked like after 8 years of service. Maybe drive up to the old house on Willowbrook Lane in the small mountain town of Cedar Falls, walk through the rooms that still held pieces of who I used to be before the Army reshaped my entire existence. I'm Staff Sergeant Camila Rodriguez, 31 years old, 2 tours in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq, and more therapy sessions than I care to count. My parents, Gerald and Patricia, had been living in that house since before I was born. It was a modest 2-story Victorian with blue shutters and a wraparound porch that my great-grandfather built in 1952. For 3 generations, it had been the Rodriguez family anchor. The place where roots grew deep and memories accumulated like sediment in still water. The house wasn't just a building to me, it was sacred ground. It was where my twin brother Diego and I had carved our initials into the oak tree in the backyard, where we'd spent countless summers building elaborate tree houses that doubled as military outposts in our war games, where Diego had fought his 2-year battle with bone cancer, spending his final months in the sunlit bedroom we'd shared since we were babies, where he'd drawn his last breath at 17, holding my hand, while I whispered promises about all the adventures we'd have when he got better. I was 18 when Diego died, enlisted 3 weeks after his funeral, desperate to escape a house that felt haunted by everything we'd never get to do together, but even overseas, dodging IEDs in Kandahar or training Iraqi forces in Baghdad. I carried that house with me. It was my anchor point, my true north, in the darkest moments of deployment, when the weight of war pressed down on my chest like a physical thing. I'd close my eyes and walk through those familiar rooms in my mind. I could see every detail with perfect clarity, the way morning light filtered through the kitchen windows, casting geometric patterns on the hardwood floors that Diego and I used to pretend were maps to treasure, the collection of family photographs lining the stairway walls, chronicling 3 generations of Rodriguez celebrations, graduations, and quiet Sunday afternoons. The built-in bookshelves in the living room where Diego had arranged his extensive collection of military history books, organized by war and then by author in the methodical way that had driven our parents crazy but made perfect sense to me. The basement held our childhood kingdom. Down there, behind the old furnace, Diego and I had created what we called Command Central, an elaborate fort made from old furniture, military surplus blankets, and our father's discarded electronics equipment. We'd spend hours down there planning imaginary missions, studying tactical manuals I'd checked out from the library, and dreaming about the day we'd both join the Army together. Rodriguez twins. Diego used to say, taking on the world side by side. After he got sick, that basement became our refuge. When the chemotherapy made him too weak to climb the stairs easily, I'd carry down pillows and snacks, and we'd watch old war movies on a tiny television I'd dragged down from my room. Even as his body betrayed him, Diego's mind stayed sharp, strategic. He'd analyze battle scenes with the precision of a West Point cadet, pointing out tactical errors and suggesting alternative approaches. When you're over there, he'd tell me during his worst days, remember what we learned down here? Stay smart, stay alive, come home. But it wasn't just the big moments that made that house irreplaceable. It was the texture of daily life embedded in every surface. The kitchen table where our mother Patricia had helped us with homework while the smell of her famous green chili stew filled the air. The back porch where our father Gerald taught us to clean fishing gear and told stories about his own brief stint in the Navy. The guest room closet where Patricia kept Diego's clothes untouched since his death because she couldn't bear to pack them away. When I left for my first deployment, I'd made my parents promise to keep everything exactly as it was. Don't change anything, I'd said. Standing in Diego's room the night before I shipped out to Fort Carson for advanced training. I need to know it's here, waiting for me. My mother had nodded, tears in her eyes, and promised that my room, Diego's room, even command central in the basement, would remain exactly as we'd left them. That promise had sustained me through 3 deployments, and countless nights when sleep wouldn't come. Whenever the war felt too heavy, whenever I questioned whether I was honoring Diego's memory or just running from it, I'd remind myself that home was waiting. Not just any home, but our home. With all its sacred spaces and preserved memories intact. The letters from my parents during deployment never suggested anything had changed. Patricia wrote weekly, filling pages with neighborhood gossip and updates about her garden. Gerald sent shorter notes, usually focused on local sports teams and weather reports. Neither of them mentioned financial troubles or discussed selling the house. If anything, they seemed to be doing well. Patricia had mentioned getting new living room furniture. And Gerald had written about finally fixing the front porch railing that had been loose for years. So when I stepped off the plane at Denver International Airport after my longest deployment yet, 18 months in a forward operating base outside Kabul, I was thinking about sleeping in my old bed, visiting Diego's room, maybe even spending a night in Command Central like old times. I was thinking about healing in the place that had shaped me, surrounded by the memories that had kept me sane overseas. My parents were waiting at the gate with the kind of enthusiasm I hadn't seen from them since, well, maybe ever. Gerald was wearing a new polo shirt and actually smiling, which was unusual enough to catch my attention. Patricia had gotten her hair done and was practically bouncing on her toes with excitement. They both looked younger somehow, like people who'd been carrying a heavy burden and had finally set it down. Mija, Patricia called out, using the nickname that always transported me back to childhood. She wrapped me in a hug that smelled like her signature perfume and something else I couldn't identify, something expensive and unfamiliar. Gerald's embrace was equally enthusiastic. And when he pulled back, his eyes were bright with an energy I couldn't quite place. "You look good, kiddo," he said, studying my face like he was memorizing it. "Military life suits you. You've got that officer bearing even though you're still enlisted." "Still working on my commission packet," I replied, shouldering my duffel bag. "Maybe after I take some leave and decompress." "About that," Patricia said, linking her arm through mine as we walked toward baggage claim. "We have so much to tell you. So many exciting changes." The word changes hit me like a small electric shock. In military families, changes usually meant deployments, relocations, or family emergencies. But my parents seemed genuinely excited, not stressed or worried. I tried to push down the unease that was starting to build in my chest. During the 2-hour drive from Denver to Cedar Falls, they kept the conversation light, asking about my flight, my fellow soldiers, and my plans for leave. But underneath their casual questions, I sensed an undercurrent of anticipation, like they were building towards something big. Patricia kept glancing at Gerald in the rearview mirror. And he kept clearing his throat like he wanted to say something, but was waiting for the right moment. The mountain scenery outside the window was exactly as I remembered, rolling hills covered in aspen and pine, small towns tucked into valleys like secrets. The kind of landscape that made you understand why people wrote songs about going home. But instead of feeling the familiar peace that usually came with this drive, I felt increasingly on edge. "How's the house?" I asked as we turned onto the familiar roads leading to Cedar Falls. "Everything holding up okay while I was gone?" Another glance between my parents. "Actually," Gerald said, his voice carrying that same strange excitement. "That's part of what we want to talk to you about." My stomach dropped. In the Army, you learn to recognize certain tones of voice, certain ways people prepare to deliver news. This wasn't the tone of someone about to share good news about home improvements or neighborhood developments. This was the tone of someone who had made a decision they thought was right but weren't entirely sure how it would be received. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Let's wait until we get home," Patricia said quickly. "We'll make some coffee, sit down properly, and explain everything. You're going to be so surprised." But as we drove through downtown Cedar Falls, I noticed things that didn't align with going home. We passed the turn that led to Willowbrook Lane without slowing down. When I pointed this out, Gerald said they'd moved temporarily and had some things to show me at their new place first. Moved temporarily, then ease was turning into something sharper now. From the house? Don't worry about it right now, Patricia said, but her voice had lost some of its earlier enthusiasm. Everything's fine. Better than fine, actually. They drove me to a small apartment complex on the other side of town, one of those generic developments that could have been in any suburb in America. As we climbed the stairs to Unit to be, I felt like I was walking toward a cliff in the dark. Unable to see exactly where the edge was, but knowing it was coming. The apartment was furnished with things I didn't recognize: new furniture, new decorations. Everything clean and modern and completely devoid of the warm clutter that had characterized our family home. There were no family photographs on the walls, no collections of books or knickknacks, nothing that suggested 3 generations of Rodriguez family history. Sit down, Mija, Patricia said, gesturing toward a couch that still had tags attached. I'll make some coffee. Where are we? I asked, still standing. I mean, what is this place? Gerald cleared his throat and sat down across from me. This is our new place, temporarily. We're in transition. The word transition hit me like a physical blow. In military parlance, transition usually meant one of 2 things. Someone was changing duty stations, or someone was getting out of the service entirely. But my parents weren't military. They were civilians who had lived in the same house for over 3 decades. Transition from what to what? I asked. Patricia returned with coffee and mugs I'd never seen before, her hands slightly shaky as she set them down. We have news, she said, sitting down next to Gerald and reaching for his hand. Big news. Good news, we think. Just tell me, I said, and I could hear my voice taking on the flat, controlled tone I used when briefing mission parameters. Whatever it is, just say it. Gerald took a deep breath. We sold the house, Camila. We sold the house, and we want to use the money to really live for the first time in our lives. The words hit me like incoming artillery. For a moment, I couldn't process what he'd said. Sold the house. Or house. The house where Diego had lived and died. Where 3 generations of our family had built their lives, where every room held irreplaceable memories. You sold, I started, then stopped, because my brain couldn't quite catch up to what I was hearing. You sold our house. We got an amazing offer, Patricia said quickly, her enthusiasm returning now that the secret was out. Way more than we ever expected, enough to pay off all our debts, buy a nice RV, and travel the country like we've always dreamed of doing. I stared at them, waiting for the punchline. Waiting for them to explain that this was temporary, that they'd bought it back, that this was all some elaborate misunderstanding. But they were both smiling at me expectantly. Like they'd just announced they'd won the lottery and were waiting for me to celebrate with them. What about, I started, then stopped again. What about Diego's room? What about Command Central? What about the oak tree with our initials? What about every promise you made to keep everything exactly as it was? What about what, sweetheart? Patricia asked, leaning forward with concern. Are you okay? You look pale. I wasn't okay. I was drowning in my own living room, except it wasn't my living room, because apparently I didn't have a living room anymore. I didn't have a home anymore. Everything I had carried with me through 3 deployments, every memory that had sustained me through the worst moments of war, had been sold to strangers while I was on the other side of the world, fighting to protect the very idea of home and family and the things worth defending. I need some air, I said, standing up abruptly. I need a minute. But as I walked toward the door of this anonymous apartment that smelled like new carpet and other people's lives, I realized that taking a minute wouldn't help, because in 60 seconds, I'd still be homeless. In 60 seconds, Diego would still be erased. In 60 seconds, I'd still be discovering that the people I'd trusted most in the world had destroyed everything I'd been fighting to protect. I stood outside that apartment building for 20 minutes, staring at the mountains in the distance while my world reorganized itself around this new, impossible reality. The Colorado air was thin and sharp in my lungs, nothing like the heavy atmosphere of Afghanistan, but somehow I felt like I couldn't breathe. My phone buzzed with a text from my squad leader back at base. Rodriguez. Hope you're enjoying leave, you earned it, see you in 30 days, 30 days. I was supposed to spend 30 days recovering, reconnecting, remembering who I was underneath a uniform. Instead, I was standing in a parking lot, discovering that the person I used to be had been sold along with everything else. When I finally went back inside, my parents were exactly where I'd left them, sitting close together on their new couch with matching expressions of concerned optimism. Like they genuinely believed that given enough time to process, I'd come around to their way of thinking. Feeling better? Patricia asked, patting the cushion next to her. We know it's a lot to take in. I remained standing. When did you sell it? About 6 months ago, Gerald said. The market was incredible, Camila. Houses in our neighborhood were going for almost double what we paid. We couldn't pass up an opportunity like that. 6 months ago. I tried to do the math in my head. 6 months ago, I was in the middle of my deployment, pulling 12-hour shifts training Afghan National Army units and writing letters home on whatever paper I could find. 6 months ago, I was still believing their promises about keeping everything exactly as it was. Why didn't you tell me? The question came out quieter than I intended, almost like I was asking myself instead of them. We didn't want to worry you while you were overseas, Patricia said quickly. You had enough to deal with. We thought it would be better to surprise you with the good news when you got home. Good news. I repeated the words like they were in a foreign language. You thought this would be good news? Well, yes, Gerald said, and for the first time, a note of defensiveness crept into his voice. Camila, we've been living paycheck to paycheck for years. Your mother's been working 2 jobs just to keep up with the mortgage. This house sale changed everything for us. I stared at him. What mortgage? The house was paid off. Grandpa paid it off in 1987. Another glance between them, this one less confident than before. Well, we had taken out some equity loans over the years, Patricia admitted. For home improvements, for your college fund before you joined the military, for Diego's medical bills that insurance didn't cover. Diego's medical bills. They were using Diego's cancer treatment as justification for destroying his memory. I felt something cold and sharp settle in my chest, something that felt dangerously close to the rage I'd learned to channel in combat situations. How much equity? I asked. That's not really. Gerald started. How much? About 200,000, Patricia said quietly. But Camila, the house sold for 340. We walked away with enough to pay everything off and start fresh. We're debt-free for the first time in decades. $340,000. They'd sold our family legacy, Diego's resting place, my anchor to the world, for $340,000. And after paying off their debts, they'd probably cleared less than $150,000. Diego's entire existence reduced to a line item in someone else's real estate transaction. What about his things? I asked. Diego's room, his books, his clothes. What about Command Central? The silence that followed was answer enough, but Patricia tried anyway. We kept some things. The important things. We have a storage unit. A storage unit. It's a nice one, Gerald said quickly, climate controlled. We saved his books, some of his clothes, your military awards, family photos, some of his clothes. I was starting to sound like a broken recording, repeating their words back to them like I could make them make sense through repetition. You kept some of his clothes. Honey, we couldn't keep everything, Patricia said, and now she was starting to sound frustrated. We're living in an apartment now. We don't have room for everything. But we kept the important stuff. The important stuff. As if they were qualified to determine what was important about my brother's life, what pieces of him were worth preserving and what could be thrown away like garbage. As if the baseball glove he'd worn to every game until he got too sick to play wasn't important. As if the drawings he'd made of our future military adventures, taped to the basement walls around Command Central, weren't important. I want to see the storage unit, I said. Of course, Gerald said, relieved to have something concrete to offer. We can go tomorrow. You'll see, we really did save the meaningful things. And I want to see the house. This time, the silence was longer and more uncomfortable. The house, Patricia asked. I want to see who bought it. I want to see what they've done to it. Camila, I don't think that's a good idea, Gerald said gently. It might be painful. They've made some changes. Changes, of course they had. Why would the new owners want to preserve the sacred spaces of a family they'd never met? Why would they keep Command Central intact when they could turn it into a wine cellar or a home gym? Why would they leave Diego's room untouched when it could be an office or a guest room or anything other than a shrine to a dead 17-year-old boy? I'm going to see it, I said, and there was something in my voice that made both my parents sit back slightly. It was the voice I used when giving orders to soldiers. The voice that didn't invite discussion or negotiation. Okay, Patricia said, carefully. If that's what you need to do, what I needed, I said, was for my home to be here when I came back from war. What I needed was for Diego's memory to be protected. What I needed was for you to keep the promises you made. Gerald's face flushed. That's not fair, Camila. You've been gone for 8 years. 8 years of birthdays and holidays and everyday life. We couldn't just freeze everything in place waiting for you to come home. I never asked you to freeze everything. I asked you to keep the house. I asked you to keep Diego's room. Those were the only promises I ever asked you to make. And we would have, Patricia said, her voice rising slightly, if we'd had any other choice. But we were drowning, Camila. The medical bills, the mortgage payments. The daily expenses of keeping that big house running, we couldn't afford it anymore. So you sold my brother along with the house. The words hung in the air between us like an accusation, which is exactly what they were. I watched my parents' faces change, watched them realize that this wasn't going to be the happy reunion they'd envisioned. This wasn't going to be their daughter coming home grateful for their financial wisdom and excited about their new adventures. This was going to be a reckoning. That's not what we did, Gerald said quietly. We would never sell Diego's memory. He's not in that house, Camila. He's in here. He tapped his chest. He's in our hearts, in our stories, in the way we remember him. Buildings don't hold people. Love does. But that's where he was wrong. Diego was in that house. He was in the height marks penciled on the kitchen doorframe, in the dents in the basement wall where we'd thrown tennis balls, in the worn spot on the carpet outside his bedroom door where I'd slept on the floor during his worst nights. Diego was in the very foundation of that place, and my parents had sold him to strangers who would never know they were walking through a cathedral. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.